In the autumn of 1883, in the Dakota Territory, Stephen Darrow hauled stone while his neighbors chopped wood. He was building a chimney so colossal it had a hollow sleeping chamber inside its base. Every night he crawled in. The town laughed. "Chimney man," they jeered. But Stephen had read about the great Russian stoves, the Finnish heat walls. He knew the heavy stone would store the fire's warmth and radiate it through the 40-below winter nights. If he was wrong, his chimney would become his frozen tomb. Stephen Darrow was a 39-year-old homesteader with a pregnant wife, Mara, and a young son, Benny. While every other soul in the Cannon Butte Basin stacked firewood to the rafters, Stephen sank his entire autumn into a single stone chimney. Not a normal chimney. One so thick at the base it had a hollow cavity just large enough for a man to crawl inside and sleep. Neighbors called it insanity. Survival out here meant a blazing stove and walls tight against the wind. But Stephen believed the heavy masonry could hold heat long after the fire died, radiating it slowly through the killing cold. He was gambling his family's only winter on that belief, and the cruelest blizzard in a decade was already gathering beyond the northern ridge. The question wasn't whether the chimney man's idea was clever. It was whether it would keep him warm all night or entomb him by dawn. The winter of 1883 had already killed 7 people in the territory by November, and the real cold hadn't even started yet. Frontier families survived the Dakota nights by feeding split pine into iron stoves every 2 hours, taking shifts, sleeping with one eye open. A fire that went out before dawn meant frostbite, blackened fingers, children who never woke up. Everyone knew this. Everyone except Stephen Darrow. Stephen had spent part of his 20s working on a riverboat that hauled immigrants up the Mississippi. Among them were Finnish settlers and Russian Mennonites who carried strange knowledge in their heads, not just farming but masonry. They spoke of stoves so massive they could heat a house all night on a single firing. A pech, they called it. A chilikovy. A stone heart. Most men on the frontier dismissed such talk as old-world nonsense. Stephen collected it like precious fuel. He drew sketches on scrap paper, memorized the principles, and tucked them away for a day when he might need them. That day came when he claimed his 160 acres in Cannon Butte Basin, where the winter wind could freeze a man's lungs inside his own chest. The cabin he built that summer was tight and square, but the chimney was the thing no one understood. From the outside, it rose like a stone tower, nearly 4 feet thick at the base. Inside, Stephen had constructed a hollow chamber, a narrow alcove lined with flat stones, just tall enough to sit up in, just long enough for a grown man to stretch out. He called it the warm nest. Mara, his wife, looked at the dark cavity and saw a grave waiting to happen. "You want to sleep inside a chimney," she said, not as a question. Benny, their 8-year-old son, thought it was an adventure. He helped his father haul flat stones from the creek bed, his small hands raw and red. Stephen packed clay mortar between each stone, building layers of mass that would, in theory, absorb the fire's fury and release it slowly over hours. The Russian stoves worked on the same principle, a hot, fast burn that filled the dense masonry with heat, then a sealed flue that trapped it inside. Stephen had no Russian brick, only prairie stone and river clay, but the physics were the same, or so he believed. The neighbors began calling him the chimney man before the first frost. They'd ride past on their wagons, see him perched on a ladder stacking stones while his firewood pile sat pitifully thin, and shake their heads. Ezekiel Croft, a wiry old drover who'd lost 3 toes to cold in '68, stopped one afternoon and watched Stephen slather clay into a gap. "Boy," he said, "a chimney is for smoke. It ain't a bed. You're gonna cook yourself alive or freeze trying." Stephen didn't argue. He just kept working, his beard flecked with dried mortar, his eyes fixed on the northern sky. Mara watched from the doorway, one hand pressed beneath the weight of the child growing inside her. She was due in late January, the cruelest stretch of winter. The nearest doctor was 30 miles away in Bismarck. Whatever Stephen was building, she knew there would be no help when the pain started. No midwife, no mother, just the wind and the stone and a husband who read too many books. By mid-October, the chimney was finished. Stephen built a roaring fire inside the stove at its base and let it burn for 6 hours, feeding it until the stones were too hot to touch. Then he raked out the coals, closed the flue, and crawled into the alcove. Mara watched him disappear into the dark cavity, her face pale. The silence that followed was the longest of her life. He emerged an hour later, blinking, his cheeks flushed. The stones were warm against his back, the air inside dry and still. But the heat was already fatting. By midnight, the cavity was merely tepid. Stephen sat by the cold stove, running calculations through his mind. The mass was sufficient, but the burn hadn't been hot enough. He needed a hotter fire, a longer burn, and perhaps a second layer of stone to hold the charge. Mara said nothing. She just wrapped her blanket tighter and stared at the frost creeping across the window glass. That night, the temperature dropped to 12 degrees. Stephen fed the stove every 90 minutes, the old way, the only way that still worked. The chimney stood behind him like a monument to a gamble that hadn't paid off. The following week, he rebuilt it. He tore out the back wall of the alcove, added an extra layer of stone, and adjusted the flue to draw a hotter draft. He worked in a frenzy, ignoring the whispers from the basin road. Gideon Pike, a former cavalryman who'd survived more Dakota winters than anyone in the territory, rode over to see the strange construction himself. He studied the chimney for a long moment, his gray beard caked with ice from the ride. Then he looked at Stephen. "I've seen men die from cold," he said quietly. "I've seen 'em die from fire too, but you might manage both at once." Gideon's warning wasn't cruelty. It was experience. His own brother had frozen to death in a cabin outside Fort Benton during a 3-day blizzard in '68. The chimney had drawn poorly, the fire had smothered, and they found him in the morning, stone cold on the floor, a shovel still in his hand where he tried to dig out the flue. Gideon told Stephen that story standing right there, the wind biting through their coats. "A man's got no room for fancy ideas when the real cold comes," he said. "You need wood, and you need to stay awake." Stephen listened, nodded, and went back to mixing mortar. He'd already seen what happened when his idea failed. Now he had to prove it could succeed. The new design was simpler, a single massive firebox with a long internal channel that snaked through the stone before reaching the flue. The alcove was repositioned directly above the heat channel, so the mass would soak up the fire's path like a river stone absorbing sunlight. The math suggested it would hold heat for 8 hours, maybe more. The math had to be right. By the first week of November, the basin had grown eerily quiet. The old trappers called it the held breath, the stillness that preceded a killing storm. Ezekiel Croft mentioned it at the trading post, his voice low. Something big was building beyond the Missouri River, something that would test every homestead from Fort Yates to the Cannonball. He didn't need to say who was most vulnerable. Benny asked his father, "Will we be warm when the storm comes?" Stephen looked at the chimney, at the stone that had consumed his entire autumn, and gave his son the only answer he could. "We will if I got the stones right." Mara said nothing. That night she went into the cabin and packed a small bag with blankets, a knife, a candle, and a tin of matches. She placed it beside the bed where she could reach it quickly. Not because she believed in the chimney, because she didn't. On November 9th, the sky turned the color of old iron and the first flakes began to fall. Stephen stood outside, watching the chimney, the cold already numbing his face. Inside those stones was every hope he had. Inside that cabin were the only people he loved. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the worst blizzard in a decade was preparing to bury them all alive. If the chimney failed, there would be no rescue, no second chance, no mourning. Just a frozen cabin, a stone tower, and a family that never woke. The wind announced itself before the snow did. A low, rising moan that moved across the basin like something alive and hungry. By sundown on November 9th, the cabin windows had turned white with driven ice, and the world beyond the glass had ceased to exist. Inside, Stephen fed split pine into the iron stove built into the base of his stone chimney and watched the flames curl upward through the channel he designed. The fire roared with a ferocity that startled even him. The stone drank the heat greedily. For the first hour, everything held. The chimney drew cleanly, pulling the smoke upward and away while the dense masonry around the firebox began to radiate warmth into the cabin. Mara sat near the door, wrapped in a wool blanket, one hand resting on the tight curve of her belly. Benny crouched by the stove, mesmerized by the glow showing through the narrow gaps in the iron grate. Outside, the blizzard screamed like a wounded animal, but the fire was burning too fast. Stephen had loaded the stove with enough wood to last half a night, yet within 2 hours the pile had shrunk to embers. The stones were hot to the touch, the cabin warmer than it had ever been, but the wood supply inside the house was finite. He'd stacked a cord against the outer wall under a lean-to, but the blizzard had already buried it under 3 feet of drifting snow. To reach it, he'd have to open the door into the storm and risk losing all the heat they'd gained. Mara saw the calculation in his eyes. "How long does the stone hold?" she asked. "6 hours if we're lucky, maybe 8. "And if we're not lucky?" Stephen didn't answer. He pulled on his coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and tied a rope from the door latch to his belt. "I'll be 30 seconds, he said. The words were barely out of his mouth before he wrenched the door open and vanished into a white void. The cold that rushed in was a physical blow. Benny cried out. Mara grabbed the door and held it against the wind, counting under her breath. 1, 2, 3. The rope pulled taut. 4, 5, 6. She heard a muffled crash as Stephen dug through the buried woodpile. 7, 8. Then the rope jerked twice, his signal to pull. She hauled backward with all her strength, and a moment later Stephen stumbled through the doorway, his arms full of frozen logs, his beard caked solid with ice. They slammed the door shut and barred it. Stephen dropped the wood beside the stove, his fingers too numb to bend. Mara pressed her hands around his, rubbing warmth back into them while his chest heaved. 3 seconds more and I'd have lost the line, he said. The drift's already over my head. That was when the first real fear settled into the cabin. Not the distant anxiety of a coming storm, but the immediate, choking awareness that they were buried alive. The windows showed nothing but packed white. The chimney still drew, still roared, but the world outside had been replaced by a cold, pressing weight that seemed to groan against the walls. By midnight, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped despite the fire. The stone still radiated warmth, but the ferocious wind outside was stealing heat from the outer face of the chimney faster than Stephen had calculated. He pressed his palm against the interior stone wall and felt something that made his stomach tighten. Not cold, exactly. Cool. The mass was losing heat to the blizzard, the stone acting not as a battery but as a bridge. The storm was drinking warmth straight from their home. He threw more wood into the stove, stoking the fire until the iron grate glowed a dull red. Benny had fallen into a restless sleep beneath a pile of blankets. Mara sat beside him, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. "You said it would hold," she whispered. "It will," Stephen said. "I just need to burn hotter." But a hotter fire consumed more wood. And the wood they had inside would not last until morning at this rate. He faced an impossible equation. Burn too slow and the stone would cool, the cabin would freeze. Burn too fast and the fuel would vanish before dawn, leaving them with nothing but cold stone and prayers. He sat on the floor beside the stove, staring at the flames, and began to calculate. If he could not stop the heat loss, he had to change the way they used the heat that remained. And there was only one option that made any sense. "We have to sleep inside it," he said. Mara looked up sharply. "Inside the chimney, the alcove. It's the warmest place in the house right now. The stones all around. If we all three get in, our bodies will help keep it warm. The fire will die eventually, but the stone might hold long enough if we're inside the mass." Mara stared at the dark opening at the base of the chimney. The alcove was barely large enough for a grown man to stretch out. The thought of crawling into that stone cavity with her child and unborn baby felt like climbing into a prepared tomb. "It's a hole in the wall, Stephen. It's what I built it for." The argument did not last long. The cabin was already growing colder. The wind clawed at the roof, and Mara could feel the beginnings of another false contraction tightening across her abdomen, the third that night. If real labor started now in this frozen box, there would be no help, no hope. The chimney, for all its strangeness, was the only shelter that might actually work. Stephen pulled the blankets from the bed and laid them inside the alcove. He helped Mara climb in first, her swollen body awkward in the narrow space. Then he lifted Benny, still half asleep, and slid him in beside his mother. The boy murmured something about the dark and then curled against her warmth. Stephen crawled in last, pulling a heavy wool blanket across the opening to seal them in. The stone surrounded them on three sides. The ceiling was low enough that Stephen could not sit fully upright, but the walls were warm. Not hot, not uncomfortable, but deeply, steadily warm in a way that seemed to seep into their bones. The mass of the chimney, still holding heat from the fire, radiated gently against their backs. Benny's breathing slowed. Mara closed her eyes for the first time in hours. Stephen lay awake, listening. The wind still howled outside, but inside the stone the sound was muffled, distant. He could hear the faint tick of cooling masonry, the soft rustle of Mara's hand against the blanket. The air inside the alcove was dry and still. For a moment he allowed himself to believe it might actually work. Then, near 3 in the morning, a new sound broke the silence. A deep, resonant crack that vibrated through the stone like a bell struck underwater. Stephen's eyes flew open. He crawled to the alcove opening and pushed the blanket aside. The cabin was dark, the fire down to a feeble orange glow. He could see nothing wrong with the chimney inside, but the crack had come from somewhere above. The flue maybe, or the outer stone. He scrambled out of the alcove into the freezing room and lit a candle with shaking hands. The cabin floor was icy against his bare feet. He examined the chimney walls, ran his fingers along the mortar joints looking for fractures. Near the ceiling, where the stone channel curved toward the flue, a thin crack had opened, no wider than a knife blade. Cold air whistled through it, carrying the scent of snow. The blizzard had found a weakness. The extreme heat inside and the freezing wind outside had stressed the mortar until it split. If the crack widened, smoke would pour into the cabin instead of out the flue. If it widened further, the entire upper chimney might collapse. And if that happened, the blizzard would pour inside like a river through a broken dam. Stephen pulled on his boots and coat and dragged a bucket of wet clay from beside the stove, the leftover mortar from his rebuild. He climbed onto a stool and began packing the crack with frantic precision, smearing the cold clay into the gap while the wind outside screamed against his repairs. The candle guttered. His fingers went numb. But he worked without stopping, one thought pounding in his skull: if this doesn't hold, they all die. Mara called from the alcove, her voice tight with fear. "Stephen, what's happening? A crack in the flue, I'm sealing it." "Is it working?" He pressed the last handful of clay into the fissure and held his breath. The whistle of cold air stopped. The smoke continued to draw upward through the chimney. The repair was crude, temporary, but it held. For now. He crawled back into the alcove, shivering violently. Mara pulled him close, wrapping her blanket around both of them while Benny slept on, oblivious to how close they had come to catastrophe. "It held," Stephen murmured, more to himself than to her. It held. But he knew the truth. The chimney was not the unbreakable fortress he had imagined. It was a delicate balance of fire and stone, heat and cold, and the blizzard was not done with them yet. The worst hours still lay ahead. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a terrible thought took root. If another crack opened, he might not be awake to hear it. Morning could not come soon enough. But in the depths of that frozen night, morning felt like a rumor whispered by a liar. The blizzard continued its assault, and Stephen Darrow lay inside his stone machine, listening for the sound of his idea breaking apart around him. The silence inside the stone was almost worse than the storm. Stephen lay with his ear pressed to the warm rock, listening for the sound he dreaded most: the sharp crack of splitting mortar. Every few minutes the wind outside shifted and the ceiling timbers groaned. Each time he held his breath. Each time the chimney held. But toward 4 in the morning a new sound cut through the cabin, not from the chimney, from Mara. She gasped and grabbed his arm with a grip that stopped his heart. "It's not a false one this time," she whispered through clenched teeth. A contraction rolled through her, real and deep, the kind that changed everything. Stephen knew instantly they were out of time. The baby was coming, here, now, in the middle of a blizzard with no midwife, no doctor, no way out. The only warmth left in the world was the stone around them, and the only shelter was the hollow he had built to sleep in. He scrambled out of the alcove into the dark cabin. The fire had burned down to a bed of embers, faint orange eyes glowing in the black iron stove. The room was colder now, well below freezing. He could see his breath in the candlelight. He threw the last split logs into the stove and yanked the flue open. The chimney still drew, thank God. The flame caught and heat began to creep back into the stone. But the crack he'd patched with clay was still there, and a thin ribbon of smoke was curling into the room through a new hairline fissure near the ceiling. The flue was failing. If it collapsed, the cabin would fill with smoke and then with snow. He could not fight the fire and the birth at the same time. Benny stirred on his pile of blankets, blinking in the dark. "Pa, why is Ma crying?" Stephen knelt beside his son and spoke in the calmest voice he could manage. "Benny, I need you to be very brave and very quiet. Do you remember the warm nest? I need you to go inside with your ma and hold her hand. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, his small face pale but steady. Stephen helped him crawl into the alcove beside Mara, then turned back to the chimney. The choices were narrowing into one terrible line. If he kept the fire hot, he risked shattering the flue and suffocating his family. If he let it die, the stone would begin to lose heat, and a woman in labor could not survive freezing temperatures. Stephen stared at the flames through the iron grate for a long moment. Then he made the hardest decision of the night. He let the fire burn down until it was nothing but a bed of coals. Then he closed the flue damper entirely. No more fire, no more thermal stress. The chimney would now have to survive on whatever heat the stone had already stored. He crawled back into the alcove and pulled the wool blanket across the opening. The stone walls still radiated a deep, steady warmth. Not hot, but alive. The air inside was dry and still, insulated from the freezing cabin by the chimney's mass. Mara was in full labor now, her face slick with sweat despite the cold. Benny held her hand, his eyes wide but unflinching. Stephen had no words, only his hands. He had delivered a calf once years ago on a ranch in Nebraska, but nothing prepares a man to deliver his own child in a stone hole while a Dakota blizzard tries to unmake his home. Outside, the storm continued its assault. The wind had shifted nor-northwest, driving snow against the chimney with a pressure that made the walls vibrate. Stephen could hear the drifts piling higher, sealing them in. But the chimney drew upward still. Even without fire, the flue held its shape. The crack had not widened. The clay patch, frozen solid now, was stronger than he had dared hope. Hours passed in that small, warm cavity. Time became meaningless. Mara breathed through each contraction while Stephen held her shoulders, his hands raw and cracked. Benny fell asleep against the stone, exhausted, his small breaths misting in the dark. And then, just as the first faint suggestion of dawn began to filter through the snow-packed window, a grayness so dim it was barely light at all, the baby came. A girl. She was small and red and furious, and her first cry filled the alcove like a living flame. Stephen caught her in his trembling hands, wrapped her in a strip of wool blanket, and placed her against Mara's chest. The stone around them was still warm. The temperature inside the alcove had held steady through the entire labor. Stephen looked at his daughter, at his wife, at his sleeping son curled against the stone, and for the first time in 3 days he allowed himself to cry. They stayed in the alcove as the blizzard slowly exhausted itself. The firewood was gone, but the stone remained stubbornly warm, radiating the last heat of the great fire he had fed it 2 days before. By late morning, the wind had dropped to a low moan. By afternoon, it had stopped entirely. The silence that followed was so complete it rang in Stephen's ears. He pushed aside the blanket and crawled out of the alcove on stiff, aching legs. The cabin was freezing. Frost coated every surface. But the chimney stood intact, its massive stones still faintly warm to the touch, the clay patch holding firm. He went to the door and put his shoulder against it. The drift outside had buried it completely. He dug for an hour with a tin pot in his bare hands, scooping packed snow inward, until at last a narrow shaft of pale winter sunlight broke through. He pushed his head out and looked upon a world remade. The cabin was nearly buried. The woodpile lean-to had collapsed under the drift. The basin stretched white and empty in every direction, silent and blinding. But smoke still rose from the chimney, straight upward, undisturbed. Gideon Pike arrived 3 days later after the trails had been broken. He rode in expecting to find a frozen grave. Instead, he found Stephen Darrow standing outside the cabin, splitting what remained of the buried firewood, his face raw from windburn but undeniably alive. Inside the cabin, Mara sat near the restored fire, nursing a newborn wrapped in wool, while Benny dragged a small sled around the cleared yard. Gideon dismounted and walked slowly toward the chimney. He placed his hand on the stone. Even now, 4 days after the last hot fire, it still held warmth. Not much, but enough. Enough to be felt, enough to be believed. Gideon looked at Stephen with something he had never shown before. Not amusement, not pity, respect. "You slept inside that thing?" he asked quietly. 40 nights, Stephen said. "Maybe more. It never went fully cold." The old cavalryman stood there for a long moment, his hand still pressed to the warm stone, the blizzard's memory howling in the silence between them. Then he nodded once and said nothing else. Nothing needed to be said. The chimney had spoken for itself. But the true weight of what Stephen Darrow had built was only beginning to reveal itself, because the stone did not merely hold heat. It taught heat how to behave. It transformed an uncontrollable force, fire, into a slow, patient companion that stayed through the night. And once you understand how to trap warmth in rock, you understand something that most people on the frontier never learned. Winter is not an enemy to be fought. It is a condition to be survived with intelligence. The chimney was not a defiance of nature. It was an agreement with it. When word spread through Cannon Butte Basin that Stephen Darrow's family had survived the great blizzard, and that his wife had delivered a healthy child inside a stone alcove, the visits began. Not mockers this time, but seekers. Homesteaders from 20 miles away rode over to see the chimney. They wanted to touch the stone. They wanted to understand how a man could burn a fire at sunset and still feel heat at dawn. Stephen showed them, not with speeches but with silence and stone and the steady warmth radiating from the walls. Within a year, a dozen chimneys modeled on his design had risen across the basin. Some called it Darrow Masonry. Others called it the Warm Wall. But the name that stuck was simpler. They called it the chimney bed. And the chimney bed outlived the winter, outlived the decade, outlived every storm the Dakota Territory could throw at it. The fires inside those stones were long dead, but the idea of sleeping inside the warmth, of making heat work smarter instead of harder, would echo through generations. Long before the internet, long before the viral videos of survival tricks and stove-wall sleeping, Stephen Darrow had already proved the principle with his own life. The storm that should have killed him became the proof that his idea could save others. But the question that lingered in Cannon Butte Basin long after the snow melted was this: was Stephen Darrow a genius who understood heat better than anyone else on the plains? Or was he simply desperate enough to try the one thing no one else would? The winter of 1883 became the yardstick by which every other winter in Cannon Butte Basin was measured. By spring thaw, the territory had lost 11 souls to the cold. Entire homesteads had been abandoned, buried under drifts so deep they weren't found until April. But the Darrow cabin stood open, smoke rising from its chimney like a quiet flag of defiance. Inside, the baby girl they named Ada, warmth in German, though Stephen pulled the name from a book of folk tales, slept peacefully against her mother in a room that had become a sanctuary. The great blizzard had not broken them. It had baptized the chimney in fire and ice, and the chimney had answered. In the weeks that followed, the basin turned from white to brown to pale green. Stephen began to receive visitors, not a few, but dozens. The first was Gideon Pike, who returned with a notebook. The old cavalryman did not come to offer congratulations. He came to measure. He paced the cabin floor, scratched charcoal diagrams of the flue channel, and asked Stephen the same question 3 different ways. How thick is the stone at the firebox throat? How long did you burn before you sealed the damper? Would it work with fieldstone instead of creek rock? Stephen answered each one patiently while Mara sat near the window, nursing Ada, watching the men with quiet amusement. Gideon filled 7 pages before he left. He never called the chimney a fancy idea again. Ezekiel Croft, the old drover who'd mocked Stephen's thin woodpile, arrived on a mule whose ribs showed through winter hide. He stared at the chimney for nearly an hour without speaking. Then he walked slowly around the cabin, stopped beside the alcove opening, and knelt. He put his hand inside the stone cavity and held it there while the morning sun climbed over the ridge. "It's still warm," he said, as if announcing a miracle. Stephen told him the fire had been out since dawn. Ezekiel pulled his hand back and looked at his palm as though the warmth were a thing he could keep. He asked no questions. He simply nodded, mounted his mule, and rode away. But the following autumn, a new chimney rose on Ezekiel's claim, modeled on the same principle. He called it his croft stove, but everyone else called it a darrow bed. By the winter of 1884, the design had spread beyond the basin. A blacksmith in Fort Yates built a forged chimney with a sleeping alcove for his apprentice. A stagecoach station near the Cannonball River installed a stone heat wall in its main room, based on sketches drawn from memory by a teamster who'd spent one night at the Darrow cabin. The idea moved faster than any single man could follow, carried by word of mouth through a territory where warmth meant survival. Stephen never sought payment or recognition. He was too busy raising a daughter, teaching a son, and clearing another 40 acres. But every few weeks, a stranger would appear at his door with a piece of paper and a pencil, asking to see the chimney. He never turned one away. The most profound impact, however, was not on the living. It was on the unborn. Infant mortality during Dakota winters had always been brutally high. Cold killed newborns in their cradles even when parents burned wood through the night. But the chimney bed changed that equation. A stone alcove nursery, warmed by residual heat from the day's fire, meant that Bobbies could sleep safely without a parent awake to feed the stove. Dr. Elias Voss, a physician who served the scattered homesteads between Bismarck and Fort Rice, recorded a striking decline in infant deaths among families who adopted masonry heaters. In a letter to a medical journal in 1886, he wrote, "The stone chimney, properly constructed, is a physician's ally against the cold. It is not medicine, but it is preservation." He mentioned Stephen Darrow by name. That letter would become the foundation of a quiet revolution. In Prague, a doctor read the translated article and began experimenting with ceramic heating cores based on the same principle. In Finland, where the Chilikovi stove already existed, builders took note of the American adaptation with its integrated sleeping chamber. And in the Jewish Pale of Settlement, where Russian pet stoves had warmed families for centuries, the story of an American farmer who reinvented old-world wisdom in Dakota territory became a small legend. The chimney bed was not an invention. It was a rediscovery, but it arrived at a moment when the frontier was filled with people who had forgotten what their ancestors knew. Stephen himself never sought fame. He died in 1912, aged 68, in the same cabin where his daughter was born during the blizzard. Mara had passed 2 winters before, her lungs weakened by a bout of pneumonia, but her final years were warm ones. Benny inherited the claim and added a second stone wing to the house with a chimney of its own. Ada married a surveyor and moved to eastern Montana, where she insisted that every home they built have a stone heat bed. The Darrow name faded from public memory, swallowed by the vastness of the plains, but the chimneys remained. In 1973, a historian from the University of North Dakota named Harold Greaves was cataloging pioneer structures in the Cannon Butte region when he came upon the ruins of a cabin with an unusually thick chimney base. Inside, partially collapsed, he found a hollow chamber lined with flat creek stones. The mortar was cracked with age, but the shape was unmistakable, a sleeping alcove built into the thermal mass. Greaves had never seen anything like it. He photographed the structure, sketched its dimensions, and filed a report titled Anomalous Heating Architecture on the Northern Plains. The report gathered dust for 40 years. Then in 2023, a survivalist on the internet posted a video. He had built a small stone wall in front of a campfire, let it heat for hours, then dismantled the wall and placed the hot stones inside his tent to radiate warmth through the night. The video went viral, millions of views in a week. Viewers called it genius, a survival hack for the 21st century, but a commenter with the username Plains Memo wrote, "My great-great-grandfather did this in the 1800s. He called it a Darrow bed. He lived through a blizzard that killed his neighbors." The comment sparked a small explosion of curiosity. Amateur historians began digging. Harold Greaves's old report resurfaced. The Darrow cabin ruins were rephotographed. And for the first time, the story of the chimney man who slept inside his own stone creation reached a global audience. The video that had seemed so clever, so innovative, was simply the latest echo of a truth that Stephen Darrow had proven with sweat and terror on the frozen prairie. Stone remembers heat, and a man who understands that can survive anything. The question that had followed Stephen throughout his life, was he a genius or just desperate, finally found its answer. He was both. Desperation opened his mind to knowledge the frontier had discarded. Genius gave him the courage to trust it when every voice around him screamed that he was wrong. He gambled his family's life on a hole in the wall, and the wall held. In doing so, he taught a generation of pioneers that the deadliest winter is not the one with the fiercest wind or the deepest snow. It is the one you meet unprepared with nothing but the same old solutions. As the chimney bed spread across the plains, it became something more than a piece of architecture. It became a philosophy. Build with what the land gives you. Trap the heat you earn. Trust the slow wisdom of stone. And never be afraid to look foolish while everyone else is stacking wood the same way they always have. But there was one final detail that even the most devoted chroniclers of Stephen Darrow's life almost missed. It was found in a letter Benny wrote to his sister Ada, years after their father's death. The letter had been folded inside a family Bible, tucked beneath a loose floorboard of the original cabin. In it, Benny recalled the night of the great blizzard, the crack in the flue, the knife-edge moment when their father sealed the stone with wet clay while Ada was being born in the alcove. And then Benny wrote something that no one had ever publicly known. After the blizzard passed, Stephen took his son aside and showed him a small, deliberate hollow he had built into the back of the chimney, a narrow shaft that ran from the outside air to the base of the firebox. It was an intake vent, designed to feed oxygen to the coals without opening the door and losing heat. Stephen called it the breath of the stones. He had never mentioned it to anyone else, not even Mara, because he had been unsure it would work. But it did work, and Benny built the same feature into every chimney he constructed for the rest of his life. That tiny innovation, hidden inside a wall of stone, may have saved more lives than the alcove itself. The chimney man did not just trap heat. He taught the fire how to breathe. And that perhaps is what separated him from every other homesteader who ever faced a Dakota winter. Stephen Darrow did not merely survive. He understood. And that understanding, born in terror and tested in flame, became a legacy that would outlast the cabin, the claim, the basin, and the man himself. The story of the chimney man did not end with Stephen Darrow. It never really ends. Every winter somewhere, someone discovers that a warm stone is worth more than a fast fire. The viral video of a man sleeping inside a stove wall, the survival forums debating thermal mass versus open flame, the homesteaders on YouTube building rocket stoves with cob. All of them are unwitting heirs to a desperate farmer in Dakota Territory who crawled into a hole in his chimney and refused to freeze. The technology has changed, but the principle has not. Heat is not just something you make. It is something you keep. Stephen Darrow understood that in his bones. He learned it from Finnish immigrants on a riverboat, from Russian stove diagrams drawn on scrap paper, from the terrifying silence of a blizzard that tried to kill everything he loved. He built his chimney not because he was certain it would work, but because he was certain that doing nothing was death. In that way, he was like every pioneer who ever faced down a frontier. He gambled on an idea because the alternative was unacceptable, and the idea held. Today, we live in a world where survival knowledge is a click away. You can learn how to build a Dakota fire pit in 30 seconds, or watch a tutorial on insulating your home with nothing but straw and mud. But the question the chimney man leaves behind is not about technique. It is about trust. How far are you willing to trust an idea that everyone around you calls madness? When the wind is howling and the temperature is plummeting and the people who love you most are looking at you with fear in their eyes, do you have the courage to believe in the thing you built? Stephen Darrow did, and the stone answered. There is a quiet truth hidden inside that story, a truth that applies to more than winter survival. The frontier was full of good, sensible people who stacked their wood high and still lost children to the cold. It was full of reasonable men who followed every rule and still froze to death in their beds. Darrow survived because he was willing to look foolish, willing to be mocked, willing to risk everything on a principle that the old world had already proven but the new world had forgotten. Sometimes the wisest move is not to invent something new, but to remember something old. If that idea speaks to you, if you believe that the best solutions are often the ones buried in history, waiting to be dusted off and tested again, then you are in the right place. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story, because we are not done digging. There are more forgotten lives, more lost blueprints, more men and women who stared into the teeth of impossible odds and refused to blink. And we intend to tell every single one of them. The chimney still stands, at least its foundation does, out there in what was once Cannon Butte Basin, beneath the prairie grass and the wide Dakota sky. The stone is cool now. The fire has been out for more than a century, but the warmth of that idea, the stubborn, radiant warmth of one man who decided he would not be buried by winter that will never go cold,